So we finally arrive at the last episode of the first season of Apothecary Diaries. But no worries, good news, second season is already approved and in the process of production. Although it's scheduled for next year, we still have enough shows to actually fill the gap in between. There's good shows such as Dungeon Mishi, Wolf and Spice remake is coming pretty soon, and there's so many other shows that I personally am interested, although I'm not sure if it's gonna be popular in the West. Once again, due to maybe cultural reasons, and I'm probably gonna put out some background information, historic information about shows that are to come. There's one in July, so basically summer season, that also probably requires a little bit of historic and cultural context to enjoy and understand. But that show in particular is actually quite good. It's created by the same manga artist that did Assassination Classroom. So I'm excited about that in July. I'll probably do some other background building in the meantime. Well, we arrive at the last episode of Apothecary Diaries, and this is essentially wrapping up the story that we left off last episode. Maomao's dad is buying off Maomao's mom, who unfortunately due to syphilis probably wouldn't live very long. Syphilis back then was an uncurable disease. It's only curable with penicillin and other kind of penicillin-related antibiotics, and penicillin was only discovered quite late, sometimes during and after World War II. So there's no chance that we'd have penicillin in this show, and if anything, the discovery of penicillin was pretty much by accident. Before that, if you got syphilis, it's a slow and unpredictable death sentence. Now, regardless of this, Maomao's dad doesn't care, so we should be happy for them. This is at least, at the lowest, a bittersweet ending to their story. While it didn't exactly end here, we are seeing with them connecting over the things that connected them in the first place, which is gold. And you don't see a board because it's on a bed sheet, but essentially the way it's played on a grid. Therefore, if you played it long enough and if you played it well enough, you can do it without the actual board. The actual grid board will be in your head, so you can just place it on any kind of surface and play that way. And this is a pretty nice touch to the story, because keep in mind, Maomao's dad has problem recognizing faces, so to him everybody looks undecipherable, except for Maomao's mom and Maomao. So he doesn't have a standard to go by on. Whichever person that he actually sees, he doesn't have a superficial level of judgment as to what beauty is, and that just makes the relationship much better than if you were only looking at people's outside appearance. Because everyone else, no matter how pretty, looks almost the same. They don't look any different, except for them. We're shown with balsam once again. Last time we're seeing this flower, which coincidentally is the name of Maomao's mom. And we get this brief scene of Lolan and her dad. Now, it might be pretty easy for you guys to tell, or it might not be, but this is essentially your typical evil minister sending his daughter to the royal palace to gain political leverage kind of setup. And if anything, we'd know, we'd have to be able to predict that the emperor is not going to be happy about this, that they're going to do something about it. So that's a natural assumption. Before people think about it as being spoiler or anything like that, it doesn't really feel like a spoiler to just assume that this is clearly an evil minister and his political scheme. And as any emperor would, they wouldn't be happy about any kind of ministers trying to basically play them, the way that potentially this situation we have over here is. And we get to see Maomao being served food. Once again, this is pretty stereotypically what Japanese feel like Chinese food are. Granted, the kind of stereotype that Japanese has about Chinese food is marginally better than North American, because generally speaking, there's a thing called American Chinese food, and you wouldn't be able to find any of that in China. It's made up by Chinese immigrants moving here to North America and not being able to sell like authentic Chinese food to your average North American and more judgmental kind of North American back in the 1800s. And that's basically their creation. It's somewhat different from their usual diet, but it's essentially American food with a little bit of Chinese added to it. Whereas Japanese tend to have access to a little bit more authentic Chinese food. It's just that the variety they have access to is quite limited. So what we have here is your typical soup dumpling, bowl of congee, and Peking duck. Now there's nothing wrong with that, it's just that when it comes to food that are readily available, especially for Peking duck, that's not gonna be readily available at all, because generally speaking, Peking duck are made fresh. They take about almost a day to prepare, and after they're actually grilled inside like a convection hanging oven, they're eaten fresh while they're hot. They're sliced while they're hot and eaten pretty much on the spot, because the skin is quite crunchy, and once you let it go cold, the skin will lose its crunchiness. Nobody will actually have this just lying around ready to serve. But since this is pretty much the stereotypical like Japanese understanding of Chinese food, on top of these, there's also mapo tofu and stir-fried rice. Basically, when Japanese think about Chinese food, those are the first ones that come to mind. But there are certain kind of food that are preserved for a longer period of time. For example, Chinese have like a whole variety of cold deli that are braised in soup, soy sauce, and then chilled and then sliced. A more reasonable or a more accurate plate of food would have been something like that. Something that's ready to eat on the spot and it's not prepared just for hot food. Whatever we're shown here, soup dumpling might be a little bit understandable, although they didn't have refrigeration back then, those things were made fresh as well. The only thing that might be just handily lying around would have been congee. Soup dumpling and Peking duck, generally they're not prepared and then just eaten. So they could have gotten something like a cold cut and like a pastry or a snack instead. Royal Palace kitchens generally will prepare a whole bunch of these food. In case any concubines or the emperor kind of wants a snack, they can order one and they'll bring one. But proper meals usually took a little bit longer to prepare, and at least 2 items here are proper meals. And we get this scene where Maomao's actually sent a whole dress and with this veil. What's China famous for? Historically, well, the Silk Road is one of them. To this day, China remains one of the biggest producer of silk on the planet, accounting for at least half in terms of values of all the silk products produced around the world, and historically there's no exception. Because of the nature of silk, they could be woven into this very thin, very semi-transparent kind of garment. And we do have a surviving example of very thinly woven silk from about 2,500 years ago, discovered in a tomb in China. Now we end up with Maomao dancing on the wall. Once again, not a good representation of what Chinese city walls would have been like actually. Maomao was shown climbing up the wall with like on a corner and so on. And it almost feels like this wall is inaccessible to people, where in reality this is supposed to be a wall. The whole Imperial Palace in this show is based on Forbidden City in Beijing, and those walls are readily climbable with a ramp. Now, if you are a visitor to the Forbidden City in Beijing, you might not be able to get out of the wall, but only for a specific period of time. Generally speaking, Forbidden City in Beijing have different kind of archives and different kind of artifacts on display. If there's a special exhibition going on, then the walls are closed. Usually for security reasons. Because if you get up the wall and you actually somehow get over like an inner wall and get into certain exhibits, there's a potential for you to steal things that are pretty priceless. even though you probably won't be able to make it if you actually damage this kind of priceless national treasure level artifact, it's not worth it. So generally speaking, if there's a special exhibition, the walls are closed. However, if there isn't any, walls are open to public access and people can just walk up there. Which makes sense, this is like a defensive wall, although it serves no defensive purpose anymore, given that this is like the center of Forbidden City. There's also an outer wall, and generally speaking, if armies are at your capital already, you're pretty much doomed. But the wall is still built with defensive purpose in mind. With that said, they're actually looking down with like a light on what I presume is a red light district, which just means that they're southward facing, because the real old Beijing will have Forbidden City, and the red light district is actually inside Outer City, but outside of the Forbidden City, and it's south of Forbidden City. The only thing is, it looks like it's quite crowded with buildings down this direction, whereas in reality, Forbidden City, if you look southward, nowadays there's a Tiananmen Square. Back then, there was actually a central area of forest, and buildings are not this close to the actual inner Forbidden City. There's a moat, which they actually show in the show, but the moat seems way too narrow. Generally speaking, moats are much wider, and you will be able to see the moat on the wall. And perception-wise, they could have gotten like the first row of building on this and removed all of them, and it would look much better and much more accurate in terms of even their own depiction, because they did show a moat for this Imperial city, yet it doesn't seem like there's a moat here. And she proceeds to dance on the wall. Traditional style of Chinese dance, essentially. You can see them in a lot of traditional events. Generally speaking, there will be performances in more traditional or ancient city. For example, you go to Beijing or Xi'an, especially Xi'an, because it's a capital city of the Tang Dynasty, which, compared to Beijing, which is still the capital city nowadays and serves more political purpose, Xi'an is basically a tourism city nowadays. So they'd have more shows with people dancing. And also, it feels like the wall in the show is a little bit shorter than your actual city walls in Forbidden City. Because there's a picture to compare with Forbidden City's city wall. This wall looks like it's at best about 5 meters tall, which is about 2 stories of buildings, whereas actual Forbidden City wall in Beijing are about 10 meters. 4-story building, 30 feet-ish, much taller. If you only look at stock photos, it's hard to give you a perspective on how tall they are. It takes you to actually stand below it and looking up, or actually above it and have a human as comparison to realize how tall these walls would have been. However, even with a shorter wall, 5-meter drop is ridiculous for what Jinshi did. He just made a dash and jumped down the wall and landed on his feet. How he didn't break his own leg, this is probably the second most unrealistic part of the show. It feels like he might have grabbed onto something to soften the landing, but once again, it's a 5-meter drop. He potentially might be able to make it, but if they went with the actual height of actual Beijing, Forbidden City walls, then he would have been dead. That wall, you don't jump down and be okay. If you jump down from that wall, you're gonna suffer broken bone or potential death. But with that said, we get this brief glimpse as Maomao's dad is buying off Maomao's mom, and essentially marrying her. How do we know that? She's in red. She's wearing red right now, and traditionally Chinese wedding garments and wedding gowns are red. You notice that I said Chinese, not Asian, is because as far as I know, it's pretty much a pretty Chinese thing to do. And here's why. Chinese wedding dresses are red, regardless of gender. Guys will wear red, ladies will wear red, and ladies generally will have this red veil. Unlike Western veil, this is completely opaque and non-see-through on her head. And they'll be carried around in this sedan carriage by 8 people. And that's the most traditional wedding rite of people who can afford it. Obviously, people who couldn't afford it couldn't afford to hire people to carry people around. But still, they try to get red clothes. And Chinese funeral gowns are white. So there's no chance traditionally that Chinese will wear white for weddings, because they're exclusively reserved for funerals. Now with the modern advent and essentially westernization of modern China, there were a period where Chinese would prefer the more western kind of white gowns and wedding. But generally speaking, the trend in China nowadays is moving back to wearing red for weddings. Mainly because of the same reason. Generally, Chinese associate white with funerals, so you don't want that during wedding. Now, it goes back to why I said Chinese will prefer red, is because, like the West, Japanese wedding garments are white. Like, ladies will wear this special kind of white kimono with a white cloth around their head. So, this tradition of wearing red for wedding gowns, that's pretty specific towards Chinese, because Japanese don't really do it. And we're seeing her in red, and pretty much that's a wedding gown. And we learn from the show that the dad took 10 days off for this whole event, so that's a big thing. But the thing is, he should be in red too, because wedding gown goes both ways. Guys also wear red for this exact occasion. But anyways, that's basically how things were. And once again, we get Maomao asking for Ox Bazaar again, which Jinshi probably didn't prepare. She's gonna probably ask for that relentlessly for quite a while, because it is a rare thing, and she does want it. And like her mom, her fixation is, she has a special fixation with one thing, but for her mom it's gold, for her is medicine. So she's not gonna stop. And will potentially be able to learn a little bit more. But once again, next year. So we have almost 3/4 of a year to go. Although to be honest, these 3/4 of a year, there are many exciting new shows being planned. So we won't be bored in the meantime. But at least for fans of this show, we'll know what to expect. And we'll know what to hope for. In case if you want to know a little bit more about the potential for sequels for this show, there are 15 volumes of light novels released for this show. And for the first season, 24 episodes only got us through 2 volumes. So if they're producing another 24 episodes next season, that's also only 2 volumes. That means we at least have 7 seasons worth of material to go. And generally speaking, a lot of shows don't run for that long. Hopefully this is an exception and we get more stories. But then again, this is a well-performing light novel and it's a well-written story. There's a lot of cohesion. Unlike a lot of other light novels that might be well-performing but ends up being more or less like a filler kind of thing. This one is actually filled with pretty good content, and we just hope that we continue to get more. With that said, with the conclusion of this first season, I'm probably gonna actually do a little bit more of the History Through Anime series, where I talk about anime that are related to history and somewhat related to history to hopefully give people a more grounded background when watching anime. Some of them do have slight bit of a barrier, and the more you know, you actually are able to enjoy things a little bit more. For example, Gintama. Gintama is fine on its own. You can watch it as a comedy without knowing anything. But it's heavily influenced by Japanese history, especially Japan's process during modernization, during Meiji Restoration. If you actually know a bit about that particular history and all the characters that the characters in the show are based on, then you potentially will enjoy the show a little bit more because you have a preconceived image of people. You'd understand a lot more in joke. Whereas if you didn't, you can enjoy the show fine, but you do miss it. Now, on top of my head, I can think of a few shows that are like that. Gintama being one of them, and there's also Golden Kamuy, Rurouni Kenshin, which they actually started serializing the remade anime again, and Nobunaga Cantabile. And it doesn't stop there. Even with shows that are completely, you'd think doesn't really relate to anything, like Inuyasha, they still have a lot of cultural context that is better if you know, and the more you know, the more you can actually enjoy. So hopefully you guys will find that interesting, but I'm planning on doing that when this show finally ends right now.